September 1914, a shipyard in Dunkirk, northern France. Commander Charles Rumney Sampson of the Royal Naval Air Service watched his men bolt 6mm boilerplate onto the body of a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost touring car. The steel had been scavenged from Forges et Chantiers de France, a shipbuilding works on the harbour. The chassis underneath had been designed for wealthy gentlemen to glide between country estates in perfect silence. Sampson intended to drive it straight at German cavalry patrols. The result looked absurd. A luxury motor car wrapped in grey steel with a machine gun mounted on top, crewed by sailors who had never fought on land. Within weeks, a growing flotilla of these improvised vehicles were harrying German positions between Dunkirk and Antwerp. Within months, the Admiralty ordered a standardized version with a fully rotating turret. Within years, that vehicle would fight across Egypt, Arabia, and East Africa. And when the next World War began a quarter of a century later, it would still be fighting, almost unchanged, in the same deserts. Almost no other armoured vehicle came close to matching that service record. The Rolls-Royce Armoured Car was never supposed to exist. Born from desperation and improvisation rather than any military plan, it became one of the longest-serving armoured fighting vehicles of the 20th century. In the opening weeks of the war, the Western Front was still mobile. German cavalry screened the advance of their infantry, probing Allied lines and cutting communications. The Royal Naval Air Service had been sent to Dunkirk to protect British airfields and rescue downed pilots, but Sampson recognised a broader opportunity. Motorcars armed with machine guns could perform the reconnaissance and raiding role that cavalry had owned for centuries, but faster, with greater range, and with heavier firepower. On the 4th of September, Sampson's brother Felix had proved the concept by mounting a Maxim gun on an unarmoured touring car and ambushing a German vehicle near Cassel. The attack worked, but the lack of any protection meant that a single rifle bullet could kill the driver and stop the car dead. An armed vehicle without armour was a weapon you could use exactly once. That said, Sampson's improvised 6mm boilerplate was not real armour. It stopped rifle bullets at range, but at closer distances a standard infantry round could punch straight through. It was better than nothing. Barely. The British Army wanted nothing to do with the idea. The War Office considered armoured motor vehicles a novelty with no doctrinal future. Senior naval figures were barely more enthusiastic, with 4th Sea Lord Cecil Lambert reportedly dismissing what he called the armoured car and caterpillar nonsense. It fell instead to Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, to champion the concept. Churchill authorised the formation of the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division and requisitioned every available Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost chassis in the country. What Churchill understood, and what the War Office missed, was that the internal combustion engine had the potential to transform ground warfare as completely as it was already transforming the war at sea and in the air. A vehicle that could move at 40 miles per hour, carry a machine gun, and offer its crew at least some protection from enemy fire could control roads, screen advances, and pursue retreating infantry faster than any cavalry squadron. The challenge was finding a chassis reliable enough to sustain operations over hundreds of miles without constant mechanical failure. Most existing military trucks were too slow, too unreliable, or too fragile. The answer was to start with the most dependable chassis in the world. The selection of the Silver Ghost was no accident. Rolls-Royce had won the 1913 Alpine trial, completing 2,000 miles through the Austrian Alps without a single mechanical failure. The company's reputation for over-engineering was documented fact, not marketing. The 6-cylinder inline engine, rated at 40 over 50 horsepower in Rolls-Royce's own designation, displaced 7,428 cubic centimetres. In later military specification, it produced up to 80 brake horsepower at 2,250 revolutions per minute. That power plant, designed for smooth, silent luxury motoring, would prove virtually indestructible when subjected to combat loads 3 times heavier than anything Rolls-Royce had intended. By October 1914, an Admiralty design committee led by Flight Commander T.G. Hetherington had produced a standardized armoured body. William Beardmore and Company of Glasgow manufactured 12mm rolled steel armour plates, riveted to a light internal frame and fitted over the Ghost chassis. A fully rotating turret sat on a ball bearing race on top, allowing the gunner to traverse smoothly through 360 degrees even on uneven ground. The turret mounted a single water-cooled Vickers machine gun in .303 caliber, firing at between 450 and 600 rounds per minute from 250 round canvas belts. A crew of 3 operated the vehicle. The driver sat at the front behind an armoured windscreen with a narrow vision slit. The gunner stood in the turret working the Vickers. The commander directed both. Fitting nearly a ton of steel plate to a chassis built for a 1.5-ton luxury body required careful weight distribution. The designers concentrated the heaviest armour at the front and around the turret ring, with thinner plate protecting the sides and rear. Dual rear wheels compensated for the load, and the 4-speed manual gearbox, though stressed, proved reliable. The first three-purpose-built 1914 pattern vehicles were delivered on the 3rd of December. Each weighed approximately 4 3/4 tons combat-loaded. Top speed on hard surfaces reached 45 miles per hour. Operational range stretched to 150 miles, but timing betrayed the design. By late 1914, trench warfare had frozen the Western Front solid. Cars built for open roads were useless against barbed wire and artillery. Most were withdrawn to coastal defence or reassigned to quieter theatres. In August 1915, the armoured car squadrons transferred from naval to army control. The Rolls-Royce needed a different kind of battlefield. It found one in the desert. The vehicle evolved through the interwar years rather than being replaced. The 1920 pattern introduced thicker radiator armour, solid disc wheels replacing vulnerable wire spokes, and louved radiator shields to reduce overheating. The Mark I variant added a commander's cupola, with 15 constructed. Armoured bodies were assembled at Woolwich Arsenal. A complete redesign in 1924 produced 24 vehicles with a smaller turret, permanent cupola, and distinctive anti-bullet splash rails across the bonnet. According to British Army inventory records cited by the Tank Museum at Bovington, 76 Rolls-Royce Armoured Cars remained in active service on the 1st of September 1939. Vehicles designed before the Somme were still on the front line when Germany invaded Poland. Now, before we get into the combat record that turned this vehicle into a legend, if you are enjoying this deep dive into British engineering, consider subscribing. It takes a second and it costs nothing. Now back to the place this machine was built for, even if nobody knew it yet. Egypt, 1916. The Western Desert, where temperatures climbed past 50 degrees Celsius and sand stripped paint from steel, became the proving ground the Rolls-Royce had been waiting for. Major Hugh Grosvenor, the 2nd Duke of Westminster, commanded a light armoured car brigade of 12 Rolls-Royces. On the 26th of February, 6 of his cars fought at the Battle of Agadia, helping to crush the main Senussi tribal force and capture their leader, Ghafer Pasha. 3 weeks later came the mission that entered military folklore. 92 British sailors from HMS Tara, torpedoed by a German submarine, were being held in deteriorating conditions deep in the Libyan desert. Westminster assembled a rescue column of 9 armoured cars, 26 supply tenders, and 10 ambulances. They drove 120 miles into hostile territory. The Senussi guards took one look at the approaching armoured cars and fled. Every prisoner was recovered alive. According to contemporary accounts, the round trip covered 250 miles through open desert in 22 hours without a single British casualty. Grateful survivors later presented Westminster with a silver model Rolls-Royce Armoured Car. The Rolls-Royce also served in German East Africa, where Lieutenant Commander W. Whittle's squadron supported operations against Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck's forces. German Ascari, according to accounts collected after the war, called the armoured cars the charging rhino which spits lead. At Gallipoli, RNAS armoured car crews used their Vickers guns to lay down covering fire during the landings at Sed El Bahr in April 1915, though the cars themselves may not have made it onto the beaches. In Russia, Commander Oliver Locker-Lampson led a force of Rolls-Royces across the Eastern Front, Galicia, Romania, and the Caucasus, reportedly achieving record-breaking mileage with almost no mechanical failures. Wherever the war was still mobile enough for wheeled vehicles, the car performed. T.E. Lawrence's experience elevated the vehicle from effective to legendary. After capturing Aqaba in July 1917, Lawrence requested Rolls-Royce cars for operations against Ottoman railway lines. He received 9 Silver Ghosts, 5 armoured and 4 unarmoured tenders, commanded by Lieutenants Gilman and Wade of the Hejaz Armoured Car Battery. Lawrence's personal tender, which he named Blue Mist, became perhaps the most famous military vehicle of the war. In his memoir, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence described the car's speedometers touching 65 miles per hour, despite months of desert work with only basic running repairs. When Blue Mist's rear leaf spring snapped after a railway demolition in September 1917, Lawrence shot a board in 2 with his pistol, roped the improvised wooden splint to the broken suspension, and did the ordinary work with the car for the next 3 weeks. The repair held. Over a year later, on the 2nd of October 1918, Lawrence rode into Damascus in a Rolls-Royce. His verdict, written in 7 pillars, became the vehicle's epitaph. A Rolls in the desert, he declared, was more valuable than rubies. When asked after the war what single gift he would most value, Lawrence replied that he should like his own Rolls-Royce car with enough tyres and petrol to last all his life. From a man who had been offered kingdoms, that was the highest compliment any machine could receive. The interwar decades should have killed the design. Every other armoured vehicle from World War I was scrapped or relegated to museums. The Rolls-Royce survived because it perfectly matched Britain's imperial strategy. At the 1921 Cairo conference, Churchill and Air Marshal Trenchard agreed that RAF armoured car companies were cheaper than permanent army garrisons for policing vast colonial territories. A vehicle designed for the mobile warfare of 1914 proved ideal for desert patrol operations 20 years later. Fast enough to chase tribal raiders across open ground, reliable enough to operate hundreds of miles from any workshop, armed well enough to suppress anything short of a conventional army. In Palestine, No. 2 Armoured Car Company helped quell the Arab Revolt between 1936 and 1939. In Aden, Rolls-Royces patrolled the hinterland despite the notable vulnerability of their unarmoured floor plates to buried mines. And critically, a war office starved of interwar funding was content to keep refitting a proven design rather than spending money on a new one. The result was that when war came again in 1939, Britain's frontline reconnaissance units in Egypt were equipped with armoured cars older than most of their crews. On the 10th of June 1940, Italy declared war. The 11th Hussars, stationed in Egypt, held 34 Rolls-Royce armoured cars, every one of them at least 15 years old. These had been modified with open-topped turrets, Boy's anti-tank rifles in .55 caliber, Bren-light machine guns, wireless sets and smoke grenade launchers. Crew had increased from 3 to 4. What followed astonished everyone. Within 48 hours of war breaking out, 11th Hussars patrols crossed into Libya and returned with approximately 70 Italian prisoners and no British casualties. On the 14th of June, they captured Fort Maddalena without firing a shot. 2 days later, they fought the first armoured engagement of the Western Desert Campaign, knocking out 3 Italian L-333 tankettes. Their most remarkable catch came when patrols intercepted General Romolo Lastucci, engineer-in-chief of the Italian 10th Army, along with his staff car and detailed maps of Bardia's defences. According to one popular regimental account, 2 lady friends were also found in the vehicle. The campaign climaxed at Bida Fom in February 1941. Lieutenant Colonel John Combe of the 11th Hussars led a mixed force of armoured cars, an RAF armoured car unit, and the 2nd Rifle Brigade, roughly 2,000 men in total, on a 124-mile dash through what veterans described as the worst desert they had ever seen. Combes' force reached the blocking position with 30 minutes to spare before the first retreating Italian columns appeared. The result was the complete destruction of the Italian 10th Army. 25,000 prisoners and over 100 tanks captured. Meanwhile, in Iraq, where rebel forces besieged RAF Habaniya in April 1941, 18 Rolls-Royces of No. 1 Armoured Car Company helped defend the airfield. These vehicles sat on chassis built during the previous war, making them nearly 30 years old. 3 of them, named Lion, Adder and Astra, drove under direct fire to recover a downed bomber crew. They completed the mission and returned. The Rolls-Royce was not the best armoured car of either war by any technical standard. Germany's light reconnaissance vehicles from the mid-1930s mounted 20mm autocannons, effective at ranges where the Vickers machine gun was useless. German armour thickness reached 14.5mm on lighter models and up to 30mm on later designs, with all-wheel drive configurations that the 2-wheel drive Rolls-Royce could not match for cross-country mobility. By 1943, Germany fielded armoured cars with 50mm guns capable of destroying medium tanks. Against any of these, the Rolls-Royce was from a different era entirely. The Americans offered no true comparison. The United States did not field a purpose-built armoured car until the M8 Greyhound entered service in 1943, mounting a 37mm gun with 25mm of armour. Britain had been operating armoured cars for 29 years before America produced its first dedicated design. But reconnaissance is not about winning firefights. It is about finding the enemy, reporting his position, and surviving to deliver that report. On those terms, the Rolls-Royce remained competitive. Its road speed matched or exceeded most contemporary armoured cars. Its mechanical reliability meant patrols returned when other vehicles broke down, and its decades of desert service meant crews knew the machine intimately, wringing performance from it that no specification sheet could predict. The real explanation for the vehicle's longevity lay in its civilian foundation. The Silver Ghost chassis was not built to a military specification drafted by a procurement committee working to a budget. It was built to be the finest motorcar in the world, with engineering tolerances that exceeded anything the military demanded. That standard, aimed at refinement and reliability rather than military expediency, translated into a combat vehicle that rarely broke down, even under conditions that destroyed purpose-built military alternatives. The Crossley Armoured Car, designed specifically for colonial service, overheated in desert temperatures that the Rolls-Royce handled without difficulty. Sand that clogged the Crossley's engine ran through the Ghost's generous mechanical clearances. The difference between a chassis engineered for perfection and one engineered to a price showed itself across decades of hard use. War correspondent W.T. Massey, writing in The Times in December 1916, reported that not a single Rolls-Royce engine had suffered a breakdown during desert operations. That claim, if accurate, is extraordinary for any vehicle, let alone one carrying armour through the Sahara. Replacement came in stages through 1941. South African Marmon Herrington vehicles arrived first, then Humber armoured cars with 37mm guns, and finally the Daimler, mounting a 2-pounder 40mm cannon and carrying 16mm of purpose-built armour. The Daimler was the true generational successor, a vehicle designed from the outset for the war it was fighting, yet the Rolls-Royce refused to disappear entirely. In Ireland, the 13 vehicles transferred to the Free State in 1922 had served throughout the Civil War. The most famous, Slieve na Mon, was present at Baile na Blore on the 22nd of August 1922, when Michael Collins was killed. Its Vickers gun jammed during the ambush, a bitter irony for a vehicle renowned for reliability. All 13 Irish cars served continuously until 1944, withdrawn only when wartime tyre shortages made operation impossible. 12 were auctioned in 1954 for between £27 and £60 each. One was preserved. Slieve na Mon was fully restored in 2011. It still fires its Vickers gun annually and drives under its own power. The Irish Defence Forces recognise it as the world's oldest serving armoured vehicle. At the Tank Museum in Bovington, a second surviving Rolls-Royce sits in the permanent collection. Built in Derby in 1920, armoured at Woolwich Arsenal, it served in Ireland, then Shanghai, then Egypt, then patrolled the Norfolk coast during World War II. In 1997, it carried Queen Elizabeth II as a passenger during a royal visit. It is insured for £2 million. It still runs. Think back to that Dunkirk shipyard, a naval officer, acting on his own initiative, bolting scrap steel to a luxury car because nobody in the British military establishment believed armoured vehicles had a future. That improvisation led to a production run across 3 evolving patterns, 30 years of continuous frontline service across 2 world wars, and combat operations on every continent where the British Empire fought. T. Lawrence captured the achievement perfectly. In 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he wrote 3 words that served as both verdict and epitaph. Great was Rolls, and great was Royce. 2 vehicles still running more than a century later prove he was right.